It is a treat to talk to Nic Carter. Nic is a partner at Castle Island Ventures, co-founder of Coinmetrics.io, and previously a crypto asset research manager at Fidelity Investments. He is a prominent writer, researcher, and speaker on topics surrounding Bitcoin. Nic, thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure, man. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Like we were talking about before we started recording, I have a lot of my readers are slowly getting involved in the Bitcoin space, so they're not familiar with all the people I've interviewed or am in line to interview. So if you could tell us a little bit about your experience before Bitcoin and before cryptocurrency, and what got you so hooked on the technology.
Yeah, pre-Bitcoin. So I guess my formal Bitcoin journey began in about 2016. I was at business school. I went to the University of Edinburgh. I was doing a master's in finance, and I decided my options were going to investment banking, going to equity research, or do something in Bitcoin. I didn't know what that involved. And I, was at a crossroads in my career, and I decided, okay, I don't care about investment banking, and I don't want to do, I don't want to become an analyst for like oil stocks. Like I would never be passionate about that. And, that's when I decided I'm going to just get into Bitcoin at whatever cost. And then, there was a sequence of coincidences and lucky breaks that led me to, making my career in this industry. Prior to that, I had actually worked as a journalist. I wanted to be a writer. And that's what I did. After I graduated undergrad, I wrote about corporate law, of all things. So I've always been, really interested in writing. That's probably one of my primary skills. That's one of the main things people know me for in Bitcoin land, even today. So I still, benefit from that experience. But today I'm a full-time Bitcoiner. I'm lucky enough to be able to work in this industry.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'd like to get it diving into Bitcoin itself. I'm not a big fan of asking what is Bitcoin, because it's got so many different branches, and it's kind of hard sometimes for even myself to really get across what it actually is. So instead, I'd like to hear your view on what Bitcoin means, and why Bitcoin matters.
Sure. Yeah, I do have an answer for what Bitcoin is, by the way.
If you want to give it, that would be great. Yeah.
I bet, you're right. That's less interesting. And it, that information can be found elsewhere as well. What it means to me, it's by far the most important emerging institution in the world today. So our institutions in the Western world, at least, are fraying, right? Whether it's political institutions, whether it's, non-state institutions like the press, for instance, whether it's transnational institutions like the IMF, World Bank, WT, even a time of institutional degradation. And that's not me editorializing, that's just a fact, right? These institutions have less credibility and less clout than they did 20 years ago. And that's a symptom of declining U.S. hegemony, right? In 1990, the U.S. was the unquestioned superpower in the world. And then today, it's one of two, right? We live in a multipolar world today. So the U.S. went from having 60% of subject clout influence, however you quantify it, to much less. And I'm wide eyes open about that. That's not, that's just a fact. And so as, our institutions begin to fail us, right, as our system of governance and information dissemination And, obviously, most importantly to me, our monetary institutions begin to fail us. People look for alternatives. And, the amazing thing is that Bitcoin emerged at this time when the monetary credibility of the U.S. began to erode away, right? So in 2009, foreign holders of U.S. government debt thought to themselves, hey, this doesn't make sense. Why is the U.S., basically printing huge amount of dollars to bail out their, dysfunctional financial system? That is the cost borne by everyone that owns U.S. government debt and holds dollars, but the benefits are reaped only by the recipients of those bailouts, right? The large financial institutions. And some smart foreign holders of government debt realized at this point that the dollar was effectively being plundered by the U.S. for specific political objectives. Now, of course, we didn't have enormous inflation over the next 10 years, but we're having an inflationary episode right now. So it's not like inflation is impossible or never going to happen. We're in the midst of an inflationary episode literally right now. So everybody that said we wouldn't get inflation was wrong. And, the U.S. government continues to, in a very explicit way, basically plunder people that own, that are savers, and especially people that are saving in U.S. denominations, people that own U.S. dollars, and, definitely people that own U.S. treasuries, government debt. And so that monetary institution is basically becoming less credible by the day. And right now, the U.S. is explicitly monetizing the debt in order to, create this sequence of payoffs to U.S. citizens, basically through these transfer payments, whatever you want to call them. And so, that institution lacks credibility. And in 2009, also, a new institution was created, one that is apolitical, one that relies on code and economic incentives and very clearly defined rules and rules that can't be changed. So everything that the U.S. Federal Reserve was not, Bitcoin was, right? The Federal Reserve is unpredictable. It changes frequently. It is highly discretionary. So, there's enormous influence from the 12 nodes in the network, right? The member banks, the governors. And it's very opaque, right? Like a lot of people spend their entire careers trying to determine what the Fed is going to do based on a twitch of the eyebrow at Jerome's, press conferences and things like that. Bitcoin is incredibly transparent. It's actually pretty simple, all things considered, certainly much simpler than the dollar system. Bitcoin is very credible. The rules never change. It's virtually impossible to change the rules. And when there is even the slightest tweak to the rules, it takes years. And so to me, Bitcoin is like a much more high-powered, novel institutional technology. So it's a technology in the explicit sense, but it's also a social and political technology in that it is a system that people can work together and use and rely on, and it's a system that, grants you outputs that are kind of predictable and they're the things that you expect. And so that's kind of what Bitcoin means to me. Like, as we are in this age of sort of decay and chaos, Bitcoin is one of, the very few sources of stability in the world. And it doesn't necessarily imply a belief in high inflation or anything like that. My embrace of Bitcoin is just a vote of no confidence in the old system. And the old system is failing me for a number of reasons. It's failing my peers. It's failing Americans. It's failing everyone, really. It's a highly unequal system that benefits elites in Washington, D.C., and it fails to benefit virtually everyone else, whether that's Americans or foreigners. And so that's kind of what Bitcoin means to me. It's an alternative to a system that's completely dysfunctional.
Yeah, some interesting points. And I'd always thought about Bitcoin as a social system and a political system as well, on top of the economic system. But I'd never really thought of it as a new sort of institution, a new monetary institution as such. So I know that you've written extensive, or I mean, you majored in philosophy, and sort of, I guess, tag-tailing into what Bitcoin means. What do you think are the core values, or for you, what are the core values at the root of the people, or Bitcoiners that are behind Bitcoin itself? What do you think is what drives the community to sort of coalesce behind this system?
Yeah, I think Bitcoin, the system itself, supersedes the philosophical views of any of the individuals that compose it. Like, Bitcoin has this great ability to shrug off, attempted leaders or people that, claim some authority over it and claim that they have a particular insight into, the nature of Bitcoin. Even if Satoshi returned today and wanted to shift Bitcoin in some direction, I think probably resist that, frankly. So, I kind of question the framing. I'm not, accusing you of doing this, but I do see it sometimes where Bitcoin is perceived or described as this intersubjective consensus and is, wholly malleable on that basis. Like, I think Bitcoin is much more rigid than people give it credit for. Even if it is composed by, human values and human actions, it does have this like durability that is, independent of the opinions of even the high priests of the protocol, and there's so many countless examples of people that had a position of authority in Bitcoin, ended up clashing with the protocol in some way, and ended up being, discarded, basically. Not to put it crassly. But, to answer your question, the values that I think the Bitcoin system is impregnated with are ultimately collapsed down to just a respect for property rights. That, I think, is supreme, and that is the fundamental that is, is prevalent. And you can obviously decompose that into individual features of the system, but I think everything collapses in this kind of tree-like structure back down to a very simple feature, which is a respect for property rights. And it's expressed in numerous ways throughout the different features of the system, but I think that's the fundamental, and that is what makes Bitcoin consistent with the work of, for instance, the Austrian economists from back in the day, because most of their work was motivated by this belief, this normative view. A respect for property rights is what ultimately generates economic vibrancy and growth. And a corruption of property rights or an attack on property rights is what generates, degrowth, political dysfunction, and, human immiseration. And so, obviously, I saw when it's this respect for property rights in a pure, very powerful way. And so, like, to elaborate on that slightly, so Bitcoin uses cryptography in order to mediate, this relationship between a human individual and their assets in the system. And so it obviates, it eliminates the legal requirement, the reliance on the legal system and the police force and the courts to manage who, is entitled to what property and how disputes are settled. And it just transfers that into the realm of cryptography, which is much more objective. And then it obviously makes it easier to conceal your property, which is a big part of ownership, right? Concealability means that you can own your assets even in the face of a hostile or tyrannical government or, any other kind of actor like that. That's one way that it respects it. Another way is by committing to a non-discretionary issuance schedule, because if you have discretion in the monetary policy, that's how you basically create the environment for dilution, excess dilution, and in the case of legacy monetary policy, that's how you can direct money to elites that are sort of affiliated or proximate to the printing press. That's what we call Cantillon insiders, people that can benefit from that injection of capital into the economy, which has an uneven flow throughout the economy, right? So one great example would be people who hold financial assets do extremely well when the government is engaging in quantitative easing, right? So they are direct beneficiaries from the new injection of capital into the economy. Bitcoin doesn't really permit this, right? It just has this free market auction for who's allowed to create Bitcoins. And the participants in that are industrial entities that have a relatively thin margin. So they're not really that privileged. And so by maintaining this, very rigid supply schedule, Bitcoin protects the property rights of users because you can have full confidence that the share of the network that you own is going to be, fixed in perpetuity. So that's another way it protects property rights. A third way would be through, relatively strong privacy. And I know it's not perfect, but I think it's getting better. If you have transactional privacy, that means that it's more difficult for you to be targeted or excluded or censored, by a government for the kind of transactions that you're making. And it's increasingly popular, not just in places like China, but actually in the West, in the US, to use financial rails as a means to selectively exclude, individuals from society. And so in the US, there's this very famous case study called Operation Choke Point, where the government used the banks to shut down industries they didn't like in 2013 to 2015. It's happening again now. And so to the extent you do have transactional autonomy and transactional privacy, that's another way for your property rights to be protected. It protects you from reprisals. And so those are kind of the main key characteristics, the main key values. There's more, there's certainly more, but those are probably the most important ones.
Interesting. I'd like to guide you towards Bitcoin's criticism or critiques, because you've written extensively on them. You even been made a 11-sided dice with all different Bitcoin critiques. And I just wanted to know, which one made you laugh the most? Like, which one did you think just made the least sense or just was completely unwarranted? And which one was the most reasonable and made you really scratch your head about?
Yeah, good question. So, to be clear, I don't think it's illegitimate to be critical of Bitcoin. I have plenty of critiques of the system, so I invite Bitcoiners to criticize the system because, of course, the only way it's going to grow and thrive is if it's exposed to various stress, and antagonists and things like that. However, there's this odd paradox whereby the critics of Bitcoin tend to be blinded by some political lens which they wear, which inhibits their ability to sort of think clearly about it. I would say so. Bitcoin is this deeply political idea. It proposes separating money and state, and it is a commodity style money, which analogous to gold in many ways. And a lot of people have these predispositions around that. They think that, perhaps only the state is or should be entitled to create money and to manage money. And so money outside the purview of the state is somehow illegitimate or illegal or counterfeiting or whatever. And so because Bitcoin touches on these deep philosophical rifts which already exist in society, many people lack the neutrality or the balance to engage with the system, either in a favorable or negative way, right? Because they can't distance themselves from it, because they've already made up their mind. They already have these deeply seated ideas about what money is or should be, that when they encounter Bitcoin, it sets them off. So the other problem is that, a lot of engaging with Bitcoin requires some degree of familiarity with the subject matter, but there's this adverse selection problem where if you are really intimately familiar with Bitcoin, you probably like Bitcoin at that point. That's the reason that people become familiar with it, because they think it's a compelling system and they want to learn about it. And so at that point, some of the most informed would-be critics of Bitcoin become Bitcoiners. And so it's rare to encounter someone that is super informed about Bitcoin, is able to distance themselves from the debate about money sufficiently such that they can, make fair critiques. And so that's why we sometimes parody the critics of Bitcoin, because they just fall into these traps and they issue these incredibly emotional criticisms of the system that are very weak. So I think the dumbest one I've seen in the last year comes from Nassim Taleb, the formerly eminent Nassim Taleb. And he wrote this paper where he said that because Bitcoin has this negative carry associated with it, it has effectively a cost to maintain the ledger, right? The miners need to be compensated. That let me see what the precise argument was. There was that, and then he also said because it was it effectively has no cash flows associated with it, that the value of Bitcoin actually necessarily had to be zero, despite the sort of obvious reality of it being worth, $35,000 or whatever. And so both lines of argument make absolutely no sense. There's plenty of non-dividend yielding stocks, like Amazon, that are obviously worth something because the stock is the value of it's the value of sort of the cash flows being generated, which could ultimately be converted into a dividend. But there's also plenty of commodities which have a purely monetary premium embedded into them, like gold. For instance, gold obviously doesn't yield any cash flows. And there's, fine art, for instance, doesn't yield any cash flows and it's worth something. And so there's plenty of things you can identify that don't have cash flows associated with them, but obviously, are used to store wealth. So that was a particularly stupid argument, I thought, from someone who really should know better. And then a very compelling critique of Bitcoin, I would say, one compelling critique would be, the long-term security dynamics of the system. Can it provide enough fee revenue to be secure in the long term? Maybe less of a critique and more of an observation. Frankly, we don't know how it's going to play out, so it's sort of pointless to really spend a lot of time arguing about it. But yeah, that's a reasonably good question to ask. And then also, I think another more sophisticated critique would be why would you use Bitcoin if stablecoins work really, really well? So stablecoins give you roughly the same transactional assurances as Bitcoin, right? They are a bearer style asset, which means that they are a digital bearer style asset, which means they can settle on the internet virtually immediately. They give you really nice final settlement guarantees. They're programmable. They can be, anybody can audit, certain features of the system. And they're not as trust minimized as Bitcoin, of course, but in exchange they give you exchange rate stability, and so stablecoins do more transactional value than Bitcoin today on the blockchain. And so I think one good critique would be why do you even need this digital gold thing when you've got these digital euro dollars, which people really like. And, obviously I have answers to that, but I would say that's probably one of the more subtle and better critiques I've encountered.
Interesting. Yeah. Hey, it's always fun to, I guess, to hear the critiques, like you say, of people who usually haven't read up even the white paper or haven't read any of the later on literature on Bitcoin, to hear them spout opinions and all this sort of stuff. And you touched on something that I want to touch on, which is the risks associated with Bitcoin, because this is something that my readers actually ask me often, and I'd like to hear your opinion, because there's a lot, like we said before the show, I have a lot of readers that are not in Bitcoin yet. They're just starting to learn about the technology, learn about the idea behind it. And so they come often with questions on risk. What would you say are risks associated with it? Or what would you say to a person who's just starting to learn about Bitcoin and who might be a little bit fearful of interacting with cryptography or understanding the technology or something for a beginner, you know?
Yeah, the primary risk is key management, right? So in Bitcoin, we store value as information. And that's basically the first time that we've had to do that in such a high stakes way. There wasn't really historically a way to store financial value in pure information form, such that it didn't matter who owned the information, what the identity of that person was. If you have the knowledge of the private key in Bitcoin, the protocol presumes that you're the owner, right? And so, obviously that means if someone steals my private key, they can still, effectively claim or, make economic use of that Bitcoin. And so that's, by far the most critical risk is like finding out and determining how to safely store that information in a way that you can use it when you want to transact, but in a way that's, generally secure. And, there are mitigations like multi-signature technology, which means you can devise a schema whereby, you have a certain number of keys required to create a valid expenditure, and maybe it's a 3 of 5 setup or 2 of 3 setup. So you can be robust to the loss of a key and still, have a functional setup, for instance. And so that's a good trade-off between resilience and convenience. And so that's, one way to mitigate that. Another way would just be to use a third-party custodian. But of course, with these custodians, they're not really regulated in a way, well, it depends on the jurisdiction, but they tend not to be regulated in a way that treats them like a narrow bank. Effectively, exchanges that hold Bitcoin on behalf of their depositors, they're full, or should be, full reserve institutions. They exist for golds. Like you can have a full reserve gold custody institution. So, in theory that works. In practice, these institutions fail from time to time and end up being under-reserved or losing the keys. One mitigation I've proposed is this notion of a proof of reserve, whereby the exchange frequently cryptographically proves to their depositors that they hold all the coins, that the liabilities are equivalent to the assets. And you can do this in a cryptographic way. And so that's one of the nice features of Bitcoin is that it is auditable by definition, whereas gold itself is not auditable. You can't really prove to a third party that you hold X many atoms of gold. You have to rely on these other processes like stamping the gold and only exchanging it through, accredited institutions which are trusted, and every link in the supply chain is trusted. With Bitcoin, you don't have to trust the supply chain for someone to prove to you that they own some Bitcoin. They just do a very simple cryptographic procedure. They create a signature showing, yeah, I have this Bitcoin. And so those are the primary risks, would be key loss if you're custodying it, or, the misbehavior from a larger custodian. I would say those are the difficulties. There's obviously more exotic risks that we can talk about, involved in actually transacting with Bitcoin, but those are the main ones.
Yeah, and those are the ones that I'll usually tell people and put the most focus on, at least when I'm talking about the things that somebody needs to really take care of when they're first starting out on their Bitcoin journey. I wanted to touch maybe superficially, just because we don't have much time left, but there's a lot of news coming out of China with miners moving, miners and the big China crackdown. And this is the second question that my readers really asked me is, what's happening in China, or where do you, and this is what I wanted to ask you, I guess, what do you see is happening in China? Do you see it as something positive? where do you think they're actually, like, do we have any idea, or is it public knowledge where they're moving to? Are they shutting down permanently?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's the biggest realignment in mining since industrial mining began. I think it's worth understanding why miners were in China in the first place so that we can understand what's happening right now. So why did miners go to China? Well, there's a lot of abundant and cheap electricity in China. China has the most capacious electrical grid in the world. The CCP made it an objective to build out a huge amount of energy resources, an enormous industrial grid, right, to become the world's factory. The way they actually did that ended up yielding a very unbalanced grid. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically in the southwest of China, there's a lot of hydro resources, and in the north and northwest of China, there's a lot of coal resources and increasingly wind and solar. Those regions ended up creating an enormous overabundance of energy relative to the local demand for energy consumption. And the way the grids work is you always have to balance out the production and the consumption of electricity, right? Because electricity cannot travel that far, you experience enormous line losses. You ultimately have to produce electricity near to where it's going to be consumed. But those regions I mentioned, there's 4 in particular where mining was very popular: Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, Sichuan, and Yunnan. The first 2 are heavily coal-powered with some solar and wind. The latter 2 are heavily hydro-powered. They are largely underpopulated regions relative to the rest of China. The big industrial and population centers are in the east and the southeast coast of China, right? And so that's thousands of miles away from those regions. And so that's actually why mining took place in China. That's why China got 60-70% of market share in Bitcoin mining, was because China had, through effectively administrative mistakes, right, through poor planning, central planning, had built an unbalanced grid. They built way too much hydro capacity in the southwest. They built too much coal in the northwest, and they built too much hydro and wind. They weren't utilizing these resources. That's why miners went there, because the miners could get free electricity and lots of it, right? That's the reason. Not because, Chinese people have like some special affinity for Bitcoin mining. There's no coincidence here. The reason is because for this purely economic reason, right? And so if you understand that, you're going to understand why this mining transition is occurring. It's because China in 2010 decided to integrate their grid. So they built these high voltage transmission lines from these peripheral provinces that I mentioned to the core provinces where the consumption of electricity occurs. And basically this allows them to take their fragmented grid and turn it into a unified grid. And this means that the energy that was being lost or curtailed or wasted, which the miners were taking advantage of, is no longer lost. That energy is now actually being put to other industrial uses. And so the Chinese government has a much less incentive to tolerate this extractive behavior of mining. And so that's my number one hypothesis for why they're doing this. It's not necessarily because they're creating their own digital currency. It's because the Chinese grid has changed. The reality on the ground. The peak year of curtailment as in energy wastage or loss was 2016. And every year since then, we've had less energy loss on the Chinese grid. The other thing that's obviously happening is they're rolling out their DCEP, the digital currency electronic payment system. And so they are reasserting themselves relative to both cryptocurrency and private sector transactional systems. So like you notice that China torched the Alipay IPO recently. So basically private transactional systems or private monies are being de-emphasized in China in order to benefit the centralized system that they've proposed. In conjunction with that, they're cracking down on the ways that people can offshore their wealth from the yuan to Bitcoin or to stable coins like Tether. So they're eliminating that flow. And then lastly, they're reasserting themselves relative to the major onshore exchanges, Huobi and OKX. So there's a few things at play. One is like this electrical grid transformation. They just have less of a reason to keep the grid as it is and allow the miners to extract wealth from the imbalances in the grid. The other reason, of course, is they have capital controls. They have strong incentives to, keep their capital account tightly managed, and cryptocurrency interferes with that. And so I think that's the reason they're cracking down on the exchanges. The long and short of it is they are, 70 to 90% of Chinese mining capacity will be offline within a month. Much of it is offline already. It's going to go to other jurisdictions. The number one jurisdiction is probably Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan is, politically amenable to this, and they have tons and tons of available power. The number two jurisdiction that miners are looking to is the US. But in the US, it takes 6 to 9 months to build new capacity, and there isn't that much available capacity. Miners were already moving west to the US even before the crackdown was announced. And so other jurisdictions that I've seen tossed around include Central Asia and Russia, and potentially Northern Europe, where there's hydro resources. But frankly, we don't know for sure, and it's going to take a month or two until we get some new data to find out where all the miners went. But they are leaving.
Wow, that was enlightening. Well, I think we're at the end of our time, so I just really want to thank you, Nic, for sharing your ideas, knowledge, years of experience with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Always looking to reach new audiences. Hopefully next time we can do it in Spanish once I brush up my Spanish a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. All right, man. Take care.
Thank you.